World War II witnessed unprecedented levels of destruction and devastation. Among the many brutal tactics employed, the scorched earth policy stands out as particularly harsh and effective. This strategy, involving the deliberate destruction of resources and infrastructure, was used to cripple the enemy's advance. It aimed to deny them vital supplies and hinder their ability to wage war. The Soviet Union, facing the onslaught of the German Wehrmacht, employed this tactic on a massive scale. The decision, born out of desperation, was a calculated gamble to slow down the Nazi war machine. It played a significant role in the eventual Soviet victory, albeit at a tremendous cost. The scorched earth policy was not a new invention. Its roots can be traced back to ancient times. From the burning of fields to the poisoning of wells, armies throughout history have resorted to such measures. This historical context highlights the enduring appeal of this tactic in times of desperation. The effectiveness of the scorched earth policy lies in its simplicity and ruthlessness. By denying the enemy basic necessities, it creates logistical nightmares and weakens their fighting capacity. The impact on morale is also significant as soldiers face starvation and exposure. The concept of denying resources to the enemy is as old as warfare itself. Ancient armies often burned crops and salted the earth to prevent conquered territories from supporting their enemies. This tactic aimed to starve the local population and make the land unusable for agriculture. One of the most famous examples of scorched earth tactics is the Russian campaign against Napoleon in 1812. As Napoleon's Grande Armée advanced towards Moscow, the retreating Russian forces systematically destroyed everything in their path. This included burning crops, destroying bridges, and evacuating entire towns. The devastation left in the wake of the Russian retreat played a crucial role in Napoleon's eventual defeat. His troops, facing dwindling supplies and the harsh Russian winter, were forced to retreat in disarray. This historical precedent served as a stark reminder of the effectiveness of scorched earth tactics. The Russian campaign against Napoleon provided a valuable lesson for military strategists. It demonstrated the power of environmental warfare in crippling an invading force. This lesson would be remembered and applied in later conflicts, including World War II. Facing the imminent threat of a German invasion, the Soviet Union adopted a scorched earth policy as a key element of its defense strategy. This decision was made with the understanding that it would inflict immense suffering on the civilian population. However, it was deemed necessary to prevent the German war machine from gaining access to vital resources. The implementation of the scorched earth policy was widespread and systematic. Special destruction battalions were formed to carry out the destruction of infrastructure, industrial facilities, and agricultural resources. Civilians were often forced to participate in these efforts, adding to the tragedy of the situation. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Entire cities were razed to the ground, factories were dismantled, and vast stretches of farmland were burned. The aim was to create a wasteland that would hinder the German advance and deny them the resources they needed to sustain their operations. The scorched earth policy had a profound impact on the Eastern Front. It significantly slowed down the German advance and disrupted their supply lines. The Germans, facing shortages of food, fuel, and other essential supplies, were forced to divert resources to logistics, hindering their combat effectiveness. Section 4. The Eastern Front, a landscape of destruction. The Eastern Front of World War II became a desolate landscape scarred by the scorched earth policy. The once fertile fields of Ukraine and Belarus were transformed into barren wastelands. Destroyed villages and towns dotted the countryside, testament to the brutality of the conflict. The scorched earth policy not only impacted the German invaders, but also had devastating consequences for the Soviet population. Millions of civilians were displaced from their homes, forced to flee the advancing German armies and the destruction left in their wake. Many faced starvation and disease as a result of the loss of their livelihoods and access to food. The winter of 1941-42 was particularly harsh, exacerbating the suffering of both soldiers and civilians. The combination of freezing temperatures, lack of food, and inadequate shelter led to widespread death and misery. The scorched earth policy, while strategically effective, contributed to the immense human cost of the war. The destruction wrought by the scorched earth policy had long-term consequences for the environment and the economy of the Soviet Union. The loss of agricultural land and industrial capacity hampered post-war recovery efforts. The scars of the conflict remained visible for decades, a stark reminder of the devastation of war. Section 5. Psychological warfare, crushing the enemy's spirit. Beyond the material impact of denying resources, the scorched earth policy also had a significant psychological effect on the German troops. Facing a desolate landscape devoid of supplies and shelter, their morale plummeted. The constant struggle for survival took a heavy toll on their physical and mental well-being. The realization that the enemy was willing to destroy their own land and inflict such hardship on their own people had a demoralizing effect on the German soldiers. It undermined their sense of purpose and their belief in the inevitability of victory. The scorched earth policy became a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination. The psychological impact of the scorched earth policy was not limited to the German troops. The Soviet population also suffered immense psychological trauma as a result of the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. The experience of witnessing their own land being ravaged left deep emotional scars. The scorched earth policy proved to be a powerful tool of psychological warfare. It eroded the enemy's morale, fueled their sense of frustration, and ultimately contributed to their eventual defeat. The psychological impact of this tactic should not be underestimated. Section 6. The human cost, a heavy price to pay. The scorched earth policy, while strategically effective, came at a tremendous human cost. Millions of Soviet civilians were displaced from their homes, lost their livelihoods, and faced starvation and disease. The destruction of infrastructure and agricultural resources led to widespread hardship and suffering. The forced evacuations and the destruction of essential supplies created a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. Many civilians perished from hunger, exposure, and disease during the harsh winters. The scorched earth policy, while aimed at hindering the enemy, also inflicted immense suffering on the very people it was intended to protect. The long-term consequences of the scorched earth policy were also severe. The destruction of agricultural land and industrial capacity hampered post-war recovery efforts. The loss of human capital and the psychological trauma experienced by the population had a lasting impact on Soviet society. The human cost of the scorched earth policy serves as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of war. While military necessity may sometimes dictate such drastic measures, the suffering inflicted on civilian populations should never be forgotten or minimized.